Hi, I'm Chris Heiser from Internet 2 and University of Pennsylvania, and this is Grouper Training, the Developers and Architects track, the Grouper Client, Part 1. We are going to introduce Grouper Client. We'll talk about what configuration you need to do to run it. Running the Grouper Client is command line, the documentation, and then in Part 2 of this series we'll talk about some more of the contents. This is the Grouper architecture diagram, and the Grouper client will fit over outside of the core group services inside your application or inside some of the connectors, and it's going to speak the REST XML protocol to the web services of Grouper. Basically, the Atlassian connector that Internet 2 supports uses the Grouper client, and the Koali connector also uses the Grouper client. And then when syncing groups to another grouper, that also uses the Grouper client to speak web services to another grouper instance. So the Grouper client is one Java jar that has no dependencies. So all you need is that one jar, and again, it's going to speak web service with the HTTP, XML, REST-like protocol and formatting, and you need Java 6 to run it and any operating system, so Windows, Mac, Unix, Linux, etc. It consists of that jar and then also the Grouper client properties config file, which needs to be either in the class path if you're running it in a Java application, or in the Grouper client jar, whatever directory that jar is in. And if you're running this for a command line, the grouper.client.usage.txt is going to be a big file for usage of the Grouper client, and that can be institution specific. So that's outside of the jar, and that needs to be either on the class path or the Grouper client jar, whatever directory that's in. The Grouper client jar does use some directories, like for HTTP and XML parsing, but those libraries are refactored so that they're on a different class path and they won't conflict with any other jar. So you can throw this into any application without worrying about it conflicting with anything. And it is backwards compatible, so that once you have a Grouper client and your institution upgrades the web services server, your Grouper client will still work. So to configure the Grouper client, you just need to edit the grouper.client.properties, and at a minimum, if you're using this for web services, you need to enter in the endpoint URL for your institution's Grouper web services, and then the authentication, if that's username and password usually, but it depends on your institution. And if you're using the Grouper client for LDAP, then you need the LDAP URL, LDAP URL, and the LDAP authentication if you're doing LDAP. That could be a user password as well. If you want to look in the Grouper client properties, you'll see other configuration things that you could do. Failover of Grouper web services servers, discovery of which web service servers are available, password encryption if you don't want to clear text password in the grouper.client.properties, the logging settings, especially for command line if you're not using Commons logging, how verbose you want it and what the log file is. LDAP operations, you can configure various queries to LDAP, and this client can make it easy to do those if you don't have another way. The timeout, how long it waits for a response before it considers it an error. If you're using this for XMPP messaging, you could configure that in the Grouper client properties. Grouper client for a command line could be used just ad hoc if you want to make some changes to Grouper and you don't want to use the UI. You can use it for non-Java applications, any programming language that can call a command line program could call the Grouper client command line. Though if there are a lot of calls, performance might be impacted. Scheduled tasks, you can usually cron it to to run certain things for a grouper at a certain time of day periodically. See example XML requests and responses. If you set the debug flag on the grouper client, which we'll see, it will display what XML is being sent to and from the server, so you can see what that looks like if you're coding a web services client yourself. Every feature in the Java API for the grouper client is exposed through the command line options of the grouper client. And actually the command line client uses the Java API for its processing. You can save your results to a file with a command line parameter greater than sign in Unix, but you can also pass a param to the client to do that for you as well. And an advantage to that is that it can diff the file that's there and only change it if the results are different. And the output of the grouper client is driven by expression language, and there are defaults in the grouper.client.properties. So if you don't want the defaults there, for instance, you just want a list of net IDs or something like that, you can pass in a parameter to the grouper client to change the output based on expression language, and that's what the output will be. So if you want to know what the usage is and all the operations and options of the grouper client, just type java-jar grouper-client.jar, and that will give you the usage and all the options. There is command line argument validation with the grouper client, so if you are missing an argument that's required, or you have extra arguments that are misspelled or something, it'll cause an error to help you pick that up so that you don't think that you're calling something that you're not. The arguments to the grouper client or command line are of the form --, the argument name, equals, and then the argument value. And sometimes you might need to put the arg value in double quotes if there are spaces or special characters in it. So it'll be --, arg name equals, and then quote, some value, quote. An example of a grouper client call: java-jar grouper-client.jar -- operation equals add member WS. Most of the grouper client operations end in either WS or LDAP, so you know which one you're calling. -- group name equals, and then some group name, -- subject IDs, test.subject.5. So here you could put multiple subject IDs, comma separated, and that would add all of those subjects to the group if they're not already there. Here's an example of getting members from the web service: java-jar grouper-client.jar -- operation equals get members WS -- group names equals astem : a group. So in this case, you could put multiple group names and get the members of all those groups. And then this is the default output, where it has the group index, which if you had multiple of them, they'd be 0, 1, 2, etc. Success T, code success, the group, the subject index, and the subject ID. So if you just wanted the subject IDs into a file, new line separated, you could do java-jar grouper-client.jar -- operation equals get members WS -- group names equals astem : a group, and then this is the different parameter -- output template equals, and then this is going to be an expression language, and WS subject is one of the variables that's available for this operation. So WS subject.id will give you the ID property of that object, and then in between each of them you can make them comma separated or whatever, in this case new line, so there'll be a new line after each one. Click on the quiz link in the video description to reinforce your knowledge of this topic. Thank you very much. For further information, see the mailing list, the wiki, the demo server, other trainings, etc.